Yoga teachers, are you struggling to sequence a yoga class? Do you spend hours sequencing a class to doubt if it's even good? Did you leave your 200-hour unsure of really how to put a class together? I've created a Yoga Sequence 101 training and I'm giving it to you for free because I believe every yoga teacher deserves to feel confident in their sequencing. And I apologize on behalf of the yoga industry if you left your 200-hour yoga teacher training unsure and unclear how to sequence. The Yoga Sequencing 101 training consists of 4 videos. This is the video number 1. The next video is how to sequence a beginner yoga class, and then how to sequence an all levels yoga class, and how to sequence a Vinyasa Flow yoga class. In those videos, I'm literally walking you through exactly how to sequence that style of yoga class. And in each of those videos, you'll leave with a class plan that you can go out and teach. In this video, I'll be covering what is yoga sequencing, why it's important to plan your classes, different methods of yoga sequencing, and 5 steps for peak pose sequencing. By the end of this video, you will have a method to easily plan and sequence your yoga classes. What is yoga sequencing? Yoga sequencing is how you order the yoga poses within a yoga class. Why is planning and sequencing your yoga class important? Number 1, to safely prepare your students to do poses. It's important that the body is warmed up properly before doing complex poses. Yoga is not about achieving a pose, but if you're teaching a challenging pose in class, it's important to make sure students enter the pose safely and that their body is warmed up properly before doing that pose. 2, it helps with your confidence as a yoga teacher. When you have a plan, know the journey you're taking your students on and can focus on your students and not think, what pose should I do next? You have more confidence as a teacher. 3, it ensures that you build an inclusive class. You can plan the progressions of the poses you will offer so that everyone in class has an option. And 4, it keeps your students engaged and returning to class. When a class flows smoothly and students feel they are progressing in their practice, they're learning and growing, they're more motivated to come back to class. So here are 4 reasons why I personally think it's important to plan your classes. Different sequencing methods. There are different sequencing methods, so there are many different methods. Some of them include the peak pose method, peak yoga flow method, ladder flow, reverse flow, mandala flow. So in this sequencing 101 training, we will be solely focusing on peak pose sequencing. I do teach the other methods inside of my creative sequencing YTT and my online 300-hour yoga teacher training program. What is peak pose sequencing? This is a method of sequencing where the class builds up to a peak pose or the most challenging pose taught in class. Peak poses are often balancing poses, deep back bends, or arm balances. Appropriate peak poses for class will depend on the style of class you're teaching. So a few examples are, if you're teaching a gentle yoga class, a great peak pose would be tree. If you're teaching a beginner yoga class, a great peak pose would be something like supported warrior 3. If you're teaching a slow flow class, a great peak pose might be half moon. If you're teaching a Vinyasa Flow class, maybe your peak pose is standing split. If you're teaching power yoga, maybe your peak pose is side crow. The peak pose method has a sequencing arch. So it builds up as the warm up in sequence 1, then you get to the top of that arch and you're in your sequence 2 where you teach your peak pose, and then you kind of come down from that sequence where you do your cool down, and finally Shavasana. So we were taking our students on this journey. We're building them all the way up to that peak pose. We're preparing them, and then we're having them come down from that peak pose. And this is the journey that we're taking our students on when we're doing peak pose yoga sequencing. The 5 steps to easy sequencing. Step number 1 is to create a yoga sequencing BFF list. Step number 2 is to pick your class style. Step number 3 is to pick a peak pose. Step number 4 is list out the 3 key muscles used in your peak pose. And step number 5 is to use your yoga sequencing BFF list to fill out the class template and actually plan your class. I'll dive in depth of exactly how to do these steps. Step number 1, the yoga sequencing BFF list. You're probably wondering, what the heck does BFF stand for? And that stands for best friend forever. The yoga sequencing BFF list is going to be your best friend forever when it comes to sequencing your classes. This is when you categorize the yoga poses by body part. I really invite you to pause this video and to actually fill out this template. Go through all of the yoga poses and categorize them by body part. Of course, some of them might have multiple categories because yoga poses are complex, But when you think about that pose, what is the predominant muscle that you're stretching or strengthening doing that pose? So I really highly encourage you to do this. You put all of the work up at front. Maybe it'll take you 20 minutes, half an hour to get it done, but you'll see later on how you're going to use this every single time you sequence a class, and you'll just pull from the list. It'll make the process so much quicker and so much faster. Step number 2 is to pick your class style. What style of class are you teaching? What style of yoga are you teaching? Gentle yoga, beginner yoga, slow flow, all levels, Vinyasa Flow, power yoga? And what is the difference between each of those styles? So each class style has a different intention of the class, a different ideal yoga student, and a different class format. So how do you tell the difference between these different styles of class? I've created what I call distinctions, and they can be broken down by the poses, the pace of the class, transitions used in the class, hold time of poses, themes that you would incorporate into class, use of Sanskrit, and music. So I will be breaking down beginner yoga, all levels yoga, and Vinyasa Flow yoga in this video. So what is beginner yoga? Beginner yoga is perfect for anyone new to yoga and needs to learn how to do all of the basic yoga poses and terms. There are different types of beginners, so it's important to keep this in mind. There are beginners who are completely new to movement, and then there are beginners who are new to yoga but aren't new to movement. So when you're planning your beginner yoga class, make sure you're keeping this in mind. What type of beginner are you teaching to? So I invite you to take a moment to write down what poses do you think are not beginner friendly and why. Type it in the comment section down below and let's have a little discussion. What poses do you think are not beginner friendly and why? So poses that are appropriate to teach in a beginner yoga class is it's really important to actually teach how to do all of the basic and foundational poses, right? So in beginner yoga, you're actually teaching how to do the yoga basics. So you're not just calling out pose names like downward facing dog, but how do your students actually do downward facing dog? No full vinyasas in a beginner yoga class because they actually need to be taught how to do each piece of the vinyasa and then how to put the whole vinyasa together. So beginner yoga is not the class where you're just, rinsing out in between flows with a vinyasa because the students don't yet know how to do that. And it's your job as the teacher to actually teach them how to do a vinyasa and all of the poses within a vinyasa. So in every single beginner yoga class, I always teach half sun salutation A. So that's mountain pose, arms reach up, forward fold, half lift, arms reach up, and mountain pose. So in every beginner yoga class, when we get to the standing section, I always teach half sun salutation A using blocks. And so this is what half sun salutation A is. It's mountain pose, arms reach up, forward fold, half lift, forward fold, arms reach up, mountain pose. So I teach how to do all of the pieces of the vinyasa. Here is a list of beginner-friendly yoga poses. Now, this is not a conclusive list. This is just a list to give you some ideas because a lot of times I hear yoga teachers saying, what poses are beginner-friendly? Poses that feel easy for me to do aren't easy for my students. So how do I know if the poses are actually beginner-friendly? And so I created this guide for you so that you can confidently know that the pose is actually beginner friendly. I've categorized these poses by the sections of the class format for beginner yoga. So warm-up poses that are beginner friendly, easy seat on a prop, seated neck stretches on a prop, seated wide-legged forward fold, seated forward fold, seated tree, also known as a head to knee pose, half Lord of the Fishes with the bottom leg extended, butterfly, cow phase with the bottom leg extended, seated figure 4, half butterfly, Sufi grinds, tabletop and low lunge poses, cat and cow, dancing lion, thread the needle, balancing table, child's pose, puppy's pose, gate pose, calf stretch, low lunge, lizard, half split, side angle with knee down, standing poses, half sun salutation A, chair, warrior 1, warrior 2, reverse warrior, triangle, reverse triangle, extended side angle, pyramid, goddess, wide-legged forward fold. Balancing poses, tree, eagle, hand to knee with bent knee, warrior 3 with blocks, stork, standing quad stretch. Cool down poses, all of the seated poses from the warm-up list, bridge, supported bridge, legs up the wall, recline hamstring stretch, recline butterfly, supine twist, reclined tree, half happy baby, reclined figure 4, reclined eagle. Pace of the class is slow. The transitions. So to get from low lunge poses, you start in tabletop, draw the knee to the nose, and then step the foot through the hands. You also can do this with your hands on blocks. So the hands on blocks creates more space to get the foot through. To get to standing poses, you start in mountain pose and step the foot back. And to get from standing to seated, you can say, take a seat on the mat. Do not step the foot through from downward facing dog. This class does not have to flow. It's okay to not always have smooth transitions. If you've ever noticed students who try and step the foot through downward facing dog to like a low lunge or standing pose, their foot gets stuck halfway, right? So it's our job as yoga teachers to teach them how to do this, to help build up the ability to do this by doing it in tabletop on blocks, and then eventually teaching it in downward dog with their hands on blocks so that they have the space to actually step that foot through. So tabletop, knee to nose, step the foot between the hands, come into low lunge. You also can do this on blocks, so your hands on blocks in tabletop. Draw the leg back, knee to nose, step the foot between the hands, coming into low lunge. So I do not recommend this transition in beginner because what ends up happening is that their foot gets stuck and it's really hard for them to draw it forward. Of course, it's easy for me to do that, but hard for the beginners, right? So to avoid that, I like to teach getting to low lunge from tabletop, either with hands on the mat or hands on blocks. Now for the standing poses, you can simply take your hands to your hips and step a foot back to come into standing poses. Then you'll reverse it. When you're done with your standing poses, step forward to mountain pose. And then depending on where you're going next, if you end in mountain pose after your balancing poses, you can simply say, take a seat on your yoga mat. And they'll get there however they got to get there. Hold time of poses. Hold poses for 3 to 5 breaths and cue breathing. In beginner yoga, students are probably forgetting to breathe while they're in the pose. So I like to remind them to actually breathe while they're holding the pose. Themes of classes. Teach basic yoga terms and basic yoga principles like what is yoga? What is an intention and how to set one? Dristi, namaste, get out of your head and drop into your heart. What does Om mean? What is meditation? How do you actually listen to your body? So these would be some really appropriate themes to teach in beginner yoga classes. Use of Sanskrit. Teach what the Sanskrit word means because they don't know. They're beginners. They're new to yoga. Generally, I don't use Sanskrit unless I'm teaching what the Sanskrit word means as a theme of class. And the music is generally slower and soothing music. So here is a beginner yoga class structure. It starts with the grounding and tune-in, which is about the first 5 to 7 minutes of class. During the ground and tune, it consists of 3 things. Number 1, get your students present. So this is where you share 2 to 3 sentences to allow your students to fully arrive on their yoga mat. Next, you teach a breathing technique. That could be something like Ujjayi breath, 3-part breath, square breath, alternate nostril breathing. Any of those would be appropriate in a beginner yoga class. The next is you share your theme and set an intention for class. Then you move into the warm-up section of class, which is about 10 minutes. In the warm-up, it's where you move the spine in the 6 directions while also stretching or strengthening one of the key muscles needed in your peak pose. Now, little pop quiz. What are the 6 directions of the spine? Did you say flexion and extension or that cat-cow movement? rotation, and side bending. So rotation is twisting in both directions, and then lateral side bending in both directions. So those are the 6 movements: cat and cow, or flexion and extension, rotation or twisting in both directions, and then lateral side bending in both directions. So in the warm-up section, I like to create a mini flow of 3 to 5 poses linked together that move the spine in the 6 directions while also stretching or strengthening one of the key muscles needed for your peak pose. Next, we move into the tabletop and low lunge section of class. This is about 15 minutes. I invite you here to create a 3 to 4 pose mini flow of low lunge poses that also stretch or strengthen the key muscles needed in your peak pose. After I do that, I like to actually teach my students how to do child's pose and let them know that this is their yoga home and they can come back here anytime they need to, even if I'm not telling them they can do child's pose. And then the last part of this tabletop and low lunge section is where you actually teach a piece of the vinyasa. So I like to do this in 3 chunks. So how to actually do downward facing dog, I would do that in 1 class. The next class, I would practice the movement of how to go from downward dog to plank. And then the next class, I would teach how to do chaturanga with the knees down. And then the next class, I would teach how to do cobra pose. And then I would just simply put that on repeat, right? Students do not know how to do a vinyasa. So it's your job as the beginner yoga teacher to teach them how to do the pieces of the vinyasa so eventually that they can put it together safely. And next we move into the standing poses, which is about 10 minutes. I always start the standing section by teaching half sun salutation A with blocks. That's mountain pose, arms reach up, forward fold, half lift, forward fold, arms reach up, mountain pose. And then I create a 3 to 4 standing pose mini flow where they're linked together. Next, we move into the balancing section of class, which is about 5 minutes. And this is normally your peak pose in a beginner yoga class. I pick one balancing pose and I teach it in a progressive manner. So I pick one pose, but I teach 3 options of that pose, starting with the most accessible, then the more challenging, and then the most challenging variation of that one pose. Then I move into the cool down, which is about 10 minutes of class. This includes forward folds and back bends. So in this section, I invite you to create a mini flow of 3 to 4 cool down poses that incorporate forward folds and back bends. And then I move into Shavasana, which is about 3 to 5 minutes. So here is a pretty version of a beginner yoga class template that I created. And then here is the Google document version that I personally like to use because I like to type my classes and save them on Google Drive so I can go back to them. Now we'll move into all levels yoga. What is all levels yoga? This is a class that has mixed levels within the class. The class experience can range from having never done yoga before to having years of experience. What poses are appropriate to teach in an all levels yoga class? All of the beginner poses that we just went over, and then adding in how to teach poses like runner's lunge, standing split, dancer, yogi squat, half yogi squat, pigeon, standing hand of foot pose, half moon, revolved half moon, bow pose, camel, twisted triangle, balancing pyramid, and twisted pyramid. Teach the first vinyasa with the knees down. So you're always teaching your students in an all levels class how to do a vinyasa with the knees down. And then you can give them the option to do a vinyasa or to skip the vinyasa. Teach poses in a progressive manner. This is key to teaching an all levels class. Poses are like a spectrum, and the variations you teach will depend on the style of class and who's in your class. Teaching progressively means breaking the poses or movements down into different options. Start by teaching everyone in class the most accessible option and then say something like, if you feel a lot of sensation, stay here. Or if you want more, try this. Then introduce the next option with, you can stay here, or if you want to challenge yourself, try this. Finally, offer the most challenging option. This approach allows everyone in class to explore poses at their own pace without feeling defeated if they can't do the full expression of the pose. Avoid starting with the most challenging option and then saying something like, if you can't do this, grab your block or take child's pose. It leaves students feeling defeated, embarrassed, and discouraged. Let me know if you can hear the difference in cueing between these 2 cueing options. Can you hear the difference in cueing between this? Come into Warrior 3. If you can't do the full expression of the pose, take your hands to the mat. And this. Inhale, take your hands to the blocks. Exhale, lift your back left leg into the air. Option to stay right here, just like this, in supported warrior 3, or if you want to challenge your balance, cactus your arms. If this feels super easy for you, option to find a twist. Inhale, left elbow down or right elbow up. Exhale, back to center. Find your variation of warrior 3. Could you hear the difference in cueing? The pace of an all levels class is still on the slower side, and you flow all of the poses together. So unlike beginner yoga, an all levels class shouldn't be choppy. You hold the poses still between 3 to 5 breaths, and everything flows together smoothly. Transitions. Everything flows together. You're teaching how to step the foot through from a downward facing dog. So maybe you're having your students do this with their hands on blocks in downward facing dog, and they're stepping the foot through. And you're having fun incorporating some creative yet accessible transitions. The whole time of poses is 3 to 5 breaths. You don't have to cue breathing while holding the poses. Instead, you can drop wisdom drops related to your theme or your intention that you set. And themes of classes are getting more into the energetics of yoga, maybe the chakras, mudras, koshas, things like that. Use of Sanskrit. You use basic Sanskrit taught in beginner, Om, Namaste, Dristi, and if you're using other Sanskrit words, teach students what they mean, and the music matches the theme and pace of class. Here is the class structure for an all levels class. So we start again with the grounding and tune-in, which is about the first 5 minutes of class. You get your students present, you teach a breathing technique, you share your theme and set an intention for class. Then we move into the warm-up, which is about 10 minutes. The warm-up is when you move the spine in the 6 directions while also stretching one of the key muscles needed in your peak pose. And I invite you in this section of class to create a 3 to 5 pose mini flow linking the poses together. This is a good class style to mix up the warm-ups and teach a warm-up on the belly, in tabletop, or child's pose. Then you move into sequence 1, which is about 10 minutes of class. You create a mini flow here combining low lunge poses and or standing poses, and then you teach a modified vinyasa in between sides. So this is where you teach how to do the vinyasa with the knees down. Then you move into sun salutation A, which is about 5 minutes. You can teach one sun salutation A here, and you can even add in a creative variation of sun salutation A here. Then you move into sequence 2, which is about 15 minutes of class. And this is where your peak pose goes in sequence 2. You create a flow of about 5 to 7 poses, combining standing and balancing poses together, and you can offer vinyasa between sides. Then we move into the cool down, which is about 10 minutes. You create a flow linking together forward folds and back bends. And then you move into Shavasana, which is about 3 to 5 minutes. Here is a all levels class template that I've made. This is like the pretty version. And then here is the Google document version. What is a flow yoga? This is perfect for the seasoned yogi who is meant to be physically and mentally challenged. This person wants to be physically and mentally challenged. They've already mastered the basic yoga poses. So what poses do you teach in this flow level class? All the beginner yoga poses, all of the all-level yoga poses, plus teaching how to do more advanced poses like crow, split, wheel, headstand, king pigeon, double pigeon, mermaid, forearm plank, dolphin, fallen triangle, half moon with toe taps or cactus arms, vines, bird of paradise, and compass. Pace of class. Faster paced, transitions, all poses flow together and connect together. Fun and challenging transitions are taught in this style of yoga. The hold time of poses can vary. 3 breaths a pose sometimes, or maybe moving 1 breath, 1 movement. Themes of class can teach themes that expand your students' minds. Use of Sanskrit. Use basic Sanskrit that students learn in beginner yoga. Can teach poses in Sanskrit, and the music matches the pace and tempo of class. Here is a flow yoga class structure. So we start again with the grounding and tune-in, which is about the first 5 to 7 minutes of class. You get your students present, you teach a breathing technique, you share your theme and set an intention for class. Then you move into the warm-up, which is about 10 minutes. The warm-up is where you move the spine in the 6 directions while also stretching or strengthening one of the key muscles needed in your peak pose. You create a mini flow of 3 to 5 poses linked together. Then you move into sequence 1, which is about 10 minutes. You're preparing here for the peak pose. So you create a flow of about 5 to 7 low lunge or standing poses linked together, and you teach a vinyasa between the sides. Then you move into sun salutation A, which is about 7 minutes of class, and you teach 3 rounds of sun salutation A. You absolutely can add in a creative variation of sun salutation A. Then you move into sequence 2, which is around 10 minutes. You This includes your peak pose. So you create a flow of about 5 to 7 standing and balancing poses linked together, and you teach a vinyasa between sides. Your cool down is about 10 minutes, and this includes forward folds, back bends, and inversions, and then you move into Shavasana for about 3 to 5 minutes. Here is your pretty template version, and then here is your Google Doc version of a template. So now that you know these class distinctions, step number 2 is to pick your class style. Step number 3 is to pick your peak pose. And remember, the peak pose is the most challenging pose in your sequence. Your whole sequence is building up to this pose and preparing for this one pose you're going to teach. Remember, the peak pose is important because it's taking your students on a journey, and the peak pose is the peak or apex of that journey. It makes your sequencing intelligent and purposeful, where every pose has a purpose. There's no fluff poses. Students feel empowered because their body is open and able to try the more challenging pose. And when the pose is taught in a progressive manner, even if they can't do the most challenging variation of the pose, they can do level 1 of the pose, and they know the steps for how to get to the next level of the pose. Some peak pose examples by class style. So in beginner yoga, tree, eagle, hand to knee pose with bent knee, warrior 3 with blocks or at the wall, stork, standing quad stretch. In all levels, half moon, standing split, camel, mermaid, hand to big toe pose, revolved hand to big toe pose, warrior 3, dancer, toe stand. In flow yoga, bird of paradise, pistol squat, crow, revolved half moon, wheel, king pigeon, king dancer. The next step, step number 4, is to list the 3 key muscles used in your peak pose. And step number 5 is to use your yoga sequencing BFF list to fill out the class template. So what I like to do is do a brain dump of all of the poses that work the 3 key muscles from your yoga sequencing BFF list. So this is why I said take the time in the beginning of this video to actually pause, make your yoga sequencing BFF list, because now you already have all of those poses under that body part category, and all you have to do is write them all down on your piece of paper or copy and paste if you're typing it all. And that is literally your guide, so you know exactly what poses to put in class to prepare you for your peak pose. Because a common question I get a lot from yoga teachers is, how do I know what poses to put in class? How do I know I'm preparing my students to do the peak pose? Your yoga sequencing BFF list literally tells you what poses to put in class and what poses will prepare you to do your peak pose. So after I do that brain dump of all the poses, I create mini flows for each section of my class. So I highlight all of the poses on my brain dump that are appropriate for that section of class. And then I do like a sequencing puzzle, and I see how I can flow those poses together. And then I repeat this process for each section of class. So I do have example videos of walking you through my exact process of using these 5 steps to build a beginner yoga class, an all levels yoga class, and a Vinyasa Flow yoga class. So I invite you to watch those videos so you can follow along with me, see in action how I apply these steps, and you'll also leave at the end of those videos with a class plan that you can go and teach in your classes. So some final thoughts are, I really invite you to save your yoga sequences in a Google document or in a binder and repeat your classes every 6 months. And I invite you to bring your notes with you to class. If you struggle to memorize your yoga sequence, I also invite you to watch my YouTube video called How to Memorize My Yoga Sequence. That will give you some tips and tricks to help you remember your yoga sequence, but no, it's totally okay to bring your notes with you. And I just want to be clear when I say bring your notes, I don't mean like write out your cueing word for word and have like a script for what you're going to say in class. Your notes can be your theme and your intention. You could read that off your notes, and then just a list of poses that you want to teach, so that if you have a brain fart while teaching, you can look down and see what's next in class. So I want to make that distinction when I say bring your notes, bring your theme and Dharma talk. Totally okay to read that off your notes. Bring your list of poses, but what I don't want you to do is to bring out like a written out script of exactly how you would cue it and all of that. That's not what I'm talking about. If you took this free training and want feedback on your sequences, you can buy a class sequence audit. So check the description below for more information on that. And I would love, love, love to hear what was your biggest takeaway from this video. Thank you so much for watching this video, and make sure you subscribe and like and hit that notification bell so you're notified every single time I share a new video sharing yoga teaching tips.